So welcome to week 4 of Philosophy in the City. So this week what we'll be talking about is how exactly groups choose to do what to do. So how in cities should we choose what the government should do, what sort of rules we have, what sort of things we should build, how we should design the city. And to start, we're going to talk about voting because this is typically considered one of the basic ways that we choose in democracies. So voting is essentially a special case of choosing as a group. So we have different groups of people coming together and they're trying to make a choice. So singly, we can make choices. And typically we say that, well, you choose things that you prefer. And so what we do when we talk about choices as groups is we talk about how we can bring people together with their preferences for things and how they should combine those preferences and choose. So we can imagine that we have three people, Amy, Betty, and Carl, and they're trying to make a decision of where to order takeout from. And who they should call is not trivial, given given their preferences, perhaps. And so this problem of what we should choose based upon a group of people trying to decide what to do together is called social choice. This is a field of political science and of logic as well, as we'll see. And what I'm going to claim, not in this lecture specifically, but in others, is that this is a problem that cities face too. So this is something we should be concerned about. So how do we choose? Well, I mean, there's a few different ways. So what we're going to be concerned with in this lecture is voting, and this is called one of the choice rules. So we have people coming together with their preferences for things, and we need a rule for deciding, given those preferences, what should be chosen. So one way we can do this is look at the preferences themselves and use some sort of method to make them into a single social choice, into a single preference for the entire set of people. You might not call it a preference anymore, but it's some way of choosing given these preferences. But as we can see, this is not trivial. So deciding how to do this is not trivial at all. So we have to decide on what voting method to use. As we'll see, there's many different voting methods, and some are better than others. And basically none of them are perfect. There's different decisions can be made based upon the voting rule that you use. And as I'll discuss a little bit at the end, there is a generalized theorem about how every single voting rule you could possibly come up with has some flaw. And that's problematic, as you might expect. So another solution is to ask an expert, right? So we could say, these three people are coming together and trying to decide what to eat. Well, they could ask someone who knows a lot about food. And so you might think, yeah, this is really good, especially in some cases where the people themselves don't really know the specialized knowledge that might be required for the choice, like what sort of transportation system we should build, or what sort of zoning rules we should have in our city. I mean, you might think these require expertise of some sort, and that the people, just the general people in the city, might not be able to make a good decision. But we need to ask, and we'll specifically tackle this problem in the next lecture, but we'll have to ask, okay, we call them an expert, but what does that really mean? What are they an expert of? And this is problematic. You can think about a situation, with food. We might ask, a food snob about what should we eat, and they might give you sushi, and maybe everyone hates sushi, right? So, or they might give you some delicacy which a lot of people don't like, like foie gras or something, which you might consider disgusting. Most people may consider it disgusting, but these sort of refined palates might enjoy it. And so, you might worry about this disconnect between what the experts think are good and what the people think are good. This will be the basic problem of asking experts, as we'll see in the next lecture. And finally, instead of voting, or in conjunction with voting, as we often do in our society, you could deliberate about the issue. So you could have all these people come together, or in our case, three people deciding what to eat, and deliberate about what they should eat. They should use reason and discussion and arguments to convince each other about what is best. But this might work in some cases where certain values are shared, and you can sort of figure out which values are shared, and perhaps these will determine what you should do. But in other cases where some people just prefer some things and other people prefer different things, this doesn't seem to work. And in our case of the food, right, of deciding what sort of takeout to order, this seems like one of the cases where you couldn't deliberate over it. I mean, some people just don't like certain foods, other people do. And so there might be certain things, and this is going to be analogous to issues that cities face. There might be certain things that some people just prefer and other people don't. And you can't really decide together in a deliberative fashion what you should do. It seems like you'd have to use some other method. So we're going to start with voting. And so let's make our case more explicit. So we have three people, and we'll make this more complex down the road, but we always want to start with the simplest case. Three people come together, and the way we're going to figure out what they should do is for them to write down their preferences for what they want. And what they're going to do is they're going to write them down in order. So, for instance, someone might want one restaurant more than the other and then more than the other, and that would be in order. So let's imagine that we've narrowed down, or they've narrowed down the choice to 3 restaurants. And we could stipulate that these are the only ones they can get takeout from. So they've decided that they're going to get takeout, right? That's a choice. First of all, they might want to go to a sit-down restaurant, but they've decided that they want takeout. And these are the only choices. So this is important, actually, because this is called agenda setting, right? So they've made certain decisions already and narrowed down the field of choices to this set. How you get to that point is actually very interesting. And as we'll see at the end of the lecture, it's not trivial how we do that, because those who set the agenda, right, those who narrow down the choices actually might wield a lot of power, because they get to decide what the group actually gets to choose between. So I've picked 3 restaurants, 3 takeout places, you might think are delivery places. So Pizza Hut, 7 Seas, and Jimmy John's. And this would be their choice set, which is what we call it. And so what each member of our group has to do is they have to write down in order which ones they want. So, perhaps one person might want Pizza Hut best, 7 Seas second, and Jimmy John's third. So that means that they would prefer Pizza Hut to the other 2, 7 Seas to Jimmy John's, and Jimmy John's to none. So Jimmy John's is like the worst choice for that person. So, so here we have our choices in order. And on the previous slide, I sort of bolded a single letter, and this is what was going to stand for that choice. And so, so this is, in the area of social choice, this is how we write things. This is just some notation that you need to know. And all I mean here is, so we have Amy here, and what Amy has written down is that she prefers Jimmy John's to the other 2, right? So Jimmy John's is the most preferred, 7 Seas is the second preferred, and Pizza Hut is the worst preferred, right? So we've used greater than signs to signify preference, a preference relation, and this is an order. And we have this for the other people as well. So Betty's order is the same as Amy's, so she prefers Jimmy John's more than 7 Seas, more than Pizza Hut. And then Carl's is the reverse of theirs, actually, right? So he prefers Pizza Hut most, 7 Seas second, and Jimmy John's last. So we have to ask ourselves where, so how do we figure out who, where should eat? So who should win, who should get their most preferred choice, and who shouldn't? So, you need to first realize this is not, there's some thinking we need to do to make this choice, because there's no alternative, so there's no takeout place that is everyone's first choice. If that was the case, there'd be no problem, right? They would agree, and they could just, pick one. So a second, you have to look and see, well, it seems like 7Cs is the only preference, or the only alternative that no one ranks last, right? So they all have 7Cs in this sort of middle position. They're okay with it. They prefer one place more than it, but it is always preferred more than something else. But it's not most preferred by anyone, right? So so it has this sort of middle value, and it's unclear what we should make of that. So there's many voting methods we could use, and we're just going to look at a few and see where they get us. Okay, so the simplest method, or one of the simplest methods, and the method you're probably most familiar with, is called plurality voting. And what that means is that you take the most preferred, so everyone gets one choice, right? And what that means, functionally, is that everyone's going to choose their most preferred alternative. So what's going to happen here is Amy's going to choose Jimmy John's, Betty's going to choose Jimmy John's, and Carl's going to choose Pizza Hut. And because 2 beats 1, right? So Jimmy John's is going to get 2 votes. Pizza Hut's going to get 1 vote from Carl. Jimmy John's is going to win. So Carl is out of luck. They're going to eat at his least preferred restaurant. So let's consider a more complex choice method of voting, and this is called the Condorcet method. And this was formulated by a Frenchman who was working around the time of the French Revolution, so he's really concerned about democracy and how voting works. And so a lot of his work has made it into this area of social choice. He's one of the earlier theorists about this. So in the Condorcet method, what we do is we take into account the entire set of preferences for each individual. And how we do this is we make pairwise comparisons between each alternative and every other alternative for all of the members of our group, right? So for instance, what we want to do is we want to see how, so for Jimmy John's, how does it compare to Pizza Hut? Well, for Amy, Jimmy John's is preferred to Pizza Hut. For Betty, it's preferred to Pizza Hut. But for Carl, Pizza Hut is preferred to it. So we can conclude about the social choice for this case, because 2 beats 1. So for Amy and Betty, Jimmy John's is preferred to Pizza Hut, and only for Carl is it not. Jimmy John's is preferred to Pizza Hut. So next, we consider how Jimmy John's does to 7Cs. For Amy, it's preferred to 7Cs. For Betty, it's preferred to 7Cs. And for Carl, 7Cs is preferred to it. And so in the same way as the last comparison, we can say that Jimmy John's is preferred to 7Cs in the social choice. So lastly, we take 7Cs. And we say, it's preferred to Pizza Hut by Amy. Betty prefers it to Pizza Hut. And Carl prefers Pizza Hut to it. And so we can conclude that 7Cs is preferred to Pizza Hut. So what this also does is gives us a social choice order. So we can conclude from this an order for the entire group, right? So the order is Jimmy John's, 7Cs, Pizza Hut. So Jimmy John's is the most preferred, 7Cs is the least preferred, or is the middle preferred, and Pizza Hut is the least preferred. So notice that this is identical to both Amy and Betty's orders. And the reason is because their entire orders outnumber Carl's. So again, Carl gets kind of shafted in this way. His least preferred is the most preferred alternative in the social order. So let's finally consider a third method that's commonly used. I mean, not really in real settings, but this is sort of a common example of a voting method. It's called the Borda count. And this sort of assigns points based upon the place in every order, in every ranking where an alternative shows up. And so it also involves the entire order of each person in the group, just like the Condorcet method. And so how this works is you assign more points for an alternative showing up higher in the ranking and less points for a alternative showing up lower in a ranking. And so if you look at this group, what we might do is assign 3 points to a first place alternative, 2 points for a second place alternative, and only 1 point for a third place alternative. And so what this allows us to do is we assign these points and then we just add them up over all the participants. So Jimmy John's gets 3 points plus 3 points plus 1 point, which equals 7 points. 7C's will get 2 points plus 2 points plus 2 points, which is 6 points. And Pizza Hut will get 1 point plus 1 point plus 3 points, which is equal to 5. And so again, we have the same order that we found in the previous voting methods, which is identical to Amy and Betty's order. So we can again construct an entire social order. So you might be thinking, wow, this is great. So you've shown us 3 different types of voting methods, and we've obtained the same result in all 3 cases. I guess voting doesn't have really any problems. And, you know, it seems to validate plurality voting, which is what we usually use. It's the simplest method. It gives us a choice, right, a single choice, and, you know, that seems good. Right? So with that sort of example, it seems like plurality voting is a good voting method. But things change quite a bit when you add more people to a group, and it becomes more complex. So our choice decision is becoming more complex, and things are going to get far worse for voting. So the answer is, you know, yes, once things get more complex, this voting is going to look far less desirable. So let's see how this might occur. So here's a whole bunch of people. And now let's move to sort of an urban example, away from the food example. And imagine that they live in a city. So these are the members of a city. And they want to build a new transportation system. So they're trying to decide what they sort of want to build. And there's 3 options. So we've narrowed things down to 3 options. And this already might be problematic because someone had to narrow these down, right? These are not the only options. And we're going to further have to, you know, specify what each of these mean. So we're not going to do that here. But what does building a highway mean? Well, is it a 2-lane highway? Is it a 4-lane highway? Where is it going? There are almost infinite number of specifications that can be made for any of these. You know, same thing for subway or both. You know, what's the ratio to them? And so this will make further make more, you know, even more difficult the problem of choosing in a democratic way, because often what happens is these things are specified more by experts, right, by bureaucracy or something. And we'll talk more about that in the next lecture. And so we have 3 options, though. Build only a highway, build only a subway, or build both. You know, build a smaller highway, less highways, and a smaller subway than the other 2 options. So let's also make the claim that people have 3 different sorts of orders. So let's, you know, this is just an example. So let's just imagine that people have different orders, and here are the following ones, and then I've given sort of the breakdown of the population. And so what we see is that 45% of the population wants the highway the most, so only a highway the most. They want both of them second, so if they can't have just a highway, then they'd rather have both. And they want just a subway last. So 30% of the population wants both the most, so they like both the most. The highway, or just the subway second, and then just a highway last. and then 20% of the population wants just a subway first, both of them second, and then just a highway last. And look at, you can see these are plausible orders people might have, right? I mean, there's this sort of, if people really want just a subway, it's likely that they want just a highway least, right? And same thing for just a highway. And you might think that people who want both might, prefer the subway option more. So I mean, we can make up a story about how people could have these rankings. So it's not a crazy example. So under plurality voting, so imagine we just had a ballot measure, right? So which we often do in voting, and it just listed these three things. So you have three options. You can pick only a highway, pick both, or pick only a subway, and you get one vote, right? If we do this, then as we saw with plurality voting with only three people, everyone is going to pick their first choice. And what this means is that 45% of the people will pick only highways, 30% will pick some of both, and 25% will pick only subways. That is, if they're not voting strategically, right? So you might imagine that some people knowing that, so some people who only want subways, knowing that that's impossible, right? They could not possibly get that because there's so few of them, might pick both. So they might think about this. They might not pick the one they prefer most. And if that's the case, this would become even more complex. So that's yet another problem with voting. People can vote strategically, and there's a proof that shows that any voting method is susceptible to voting strategically. Okay, so that put that aside. But if we use this method, it shows that highway only wins. It wins a plurality vote. If we had a ballot measure, highway only would win. Okay, so should we take that at face value? Well, let's move on to the other methods. What about the Condorcet method? What about the Condorcet winner? Well, if we use this, we find that both beats out subway only 75% to 25%. Subway only beats out highway only 55% to 45%. And both beats out highway only 55% to 45%. So this allows us to have a social order, right, which I show here, of both beating out subway only, beating out highway only. So what this means is that the choice that was made when we use plurality voting, highway only, is actually the worst possible choice when we use the Condorcet method. So when we consider all rankings, so the entire set of rankings of alternatives, and get a social order out of it, highway only is actually the worst choice, and both is the Condorcet winner. So just by using a different method, a method which is not often used for voting, we obtain a totally different choice. And in fact, our choice is sort of flipped on its head in this way, which might be disturbing. So finally, let's consider the border count method, which is another method we talked about. And in this case, just going through quickly, we see that highway only gets 1.9, subway only gets 1.8, and both gets 2.3. So here's, it's even worse now, right? Because highway only got the middle, whereas in the Condorcet method, highway only was the worst case. Subway only is now the worst case for the border count, even though it was the middle choice for the Condorcet method, and both still wins. So if we're trying to construct a social order, we see that we get yet another social order with the border count. So we've tried 3 different voting methods and got slightly different results in each case. And one of those results was totally different. In the plurality voting, we got a case that lost in the other 2 voting methods. So this is a problem, as you might think, and it gets worse. So I won't go through this, but there's this theorem developed by Kenneth Arrow in the, I think it was in the 60s, late 50s and 60s. So he showed that if we make these sort of common sense assumptions of what a democratic voting method should be like, that no voting method meets all of them. And this is sort of disturbing. So I'm not going to go into details about this, but this has been taken by many people to show that deciding things in a community through voting is not an ideal way of doing it. Even if we had perfect access to everyone's preferences, even if everyone showed up at the polls, still there'd be problems with voting. Different voting methods lead to different results, and all voting methods have certain problems with them. They don't match what we might consider to be important for democratic choice. And even worse, so this is like the sort of final conclusion from most of the research on voting, is that nearly any result can be obtained from some set of preferences by simply choosing or changing two things: the voting method and the set of alternatives, right? The agenda. And as I talked about before, in our example that I just went through, we already picked the set of alternatives that we're considering, and so the agenda has already been set. And so if you can decide what voting method to use and what set of alternatives to consider, it nearly doesn't matter what the preferences of the people voting are, and that's pretty disturbing. So basically, the people who set these things have a lot of power. Okay, so those are the problems with sort of voting in general. And so next, we're going to consider more problems with voting. So more problems with this idea that we should democratically choose what to do in cities. First of all, it's not clear that people have informed preferences about various policies. So people don't know what it means to build a subway, to the east or to the west, how much to build, whether to build roads or not, what those actually mean for what they care about. They can't link those things oftentimes. So people just don't know what sort of policies or what effects policies will have. They're not informed enough. They don't have the specialized knowledge needed to make decisions. And so there's a lot of research to show that their preferences for these things aren't even stable. So even if they make these uninformed preferences, they don't keep them. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll wonder whether this matters for public choice or whether we should use these uninformed preferences anyway. Maybe it's important to have a link to the preferences of the people in a city or in a country, or maybe not. So then we'll consider whether we should instead use experts to decide what to do. But it seems like this has its own problems. So often when we use experts, it's unclear that what they're deciding is linked in an important way to the preferences of people and their well-being. So if we think that, it seems plausible that we want decisions in a country to be linked in some way to well-being of the people or preferences of the people. What we saw with voting is that it's really hard to get from preferences of people to a good choice, right, based upon that. But it seems like when we just let experts decide, they might not have a link to those either. And so perhaps this might not get us what we want, but we'll discuss that further. And there's a further problem of actually choosing those experts. Is this method of choice of experts going to be some sort of objective measure of worthiness, right? And then then the person who chooses these objective measures has a lot of power. And so oftentimes bureaucracies are supposedly full of people who got those jobs by merit, you might think, but who gets to determine what merits that are required for the job is a hard decision. And perhaps some of those people should be chosen in a democratic way, and that's how we do it in our country. We have political appointees who head the bureaucracies. And so that in that way there's some link to the people. So we'll have to consider these issues further. So so I'll have another lecture up sometime over the weekend, and then I'll have a few more next week. So I'm going to try to do quite a few lectures. This week they should be a little shorter than in past weeks. Okay, so I'll see you later.